Lincoln, England, a city of history, of cobbled streets, and a towering cathedral that watches over the flatlands. But high above the ancient stones, in the concrete brutalism of a high-rise called Shuttleworth House, a darkness was festering. It wasn't the kind of darkness that hides in shadows. It was the kind that stands in plain sight, wearing a wedding ring. To understand the horror of March 2023, you first have to understand the light that was extinguished. Holly Bramley was 26 years old. She wasn't just a statistic. She was a triplet, one-third of a bond that is supposed to be unbreakable. She was the kind of person who didn't just like animals. She lived for them. Friends described her as bright, with a little smile that could disarm you. A woman who wanted nothing more than to be loved and to care for living things. She was soft in a world that can be incredibly hard. And then she met Nicholas Metson. On paper, Metson was 28. He was a man who knew how to present a face to the world. They married in 2021, a union that should have been the start of a fairy tale. Weddings are often called the happiest day of a woman's life. But looking back, the photos from that time now seem less like a celebration and more like the locking of a cage door. The paper mask of Nicholas Metson was firmly in place. He was charming enough to get a ring on her finger, but the man beneath the mask had a history that was bleeding through the cardboard. You see, monsters rarely are born overnight. They practice. Before Holly, there were others. In 2013, 2016, and 2017, Metson had already been flagged. Previous partners had seen the flash of his rage, the way he needed to control, to dominate. But the system is a slow-moving beast, and the dots weren't connected in time to save Holly. He was a man with a previous life that was kept in the dark, a resume of abuse that Holly likely never saw in full until it was too late. The isolation began slowly, as it always does. It's the abuser's first weapon. Slowly, the calls to her mother, Annette, became fewer. The visits with her sisters dried up. Metson was building a fortress around her on the 14th floor of that tower block. He was cutting the lifelines one by one, ensuring that when he spoke, his voice was the only one she heard. But the most chilling warning signs weren't directed at humans, at least not yet. They were directed at the creatures Holly loved the most. There is a specific kind of evil required to hurt an animal, a creature that offers nothing but trust. Metson didn't just hurt them, he tortured them. There were whispers of hamsters being put into food blenders. There was a puppy, a defenseless ball of fur, that he threw into a washing machine. Imagine the sound. Imagine the terror of the animal. And then imagine Holly, the woman who loved animals more than anything, trapped in a high-rise flat with the man who did it. Why didn't she leave? It's the question people always ask from the safety of their own homes. But fear is a paralyzed state. When you live with a man who can listen to the screams of a puppy in a spinning drum and feel nothing, you know exactly what he is capable of doing to you. He had shown her exactly who he was. The police were called to the flat before. There were disturbances, but the door would open and the paper mask would slide back on. He would talk his way out, calm, collected, while Holly stood in the background, perhaps too terrified to speak the truth. By the early months of 2023, the mask was disintegrating completely. The evil monster that Holly's mother would later describe was pacing the floorboards of the 14th floor. The marriage was dead, but Metson wasn't going to let Holly be the one to bury it. He was losing control, and for a man like Nicholas Metson, the loss of control is the trigger for the unthinkable. The stage was set. The animals had been the rehearsal. Now, it was time for the main event. The silence on the 14th floor of Shuttleworth House was not peaceful, it was heavy. It was the kind of silence that presses against your eardrums, a thick, suffocating blanket woven from fear and the absolute control of one man. By early 2023, the apartment had ceased to be a home for Holly Bramley. It had become a cell, a high-rise dungeon where the only view of the outside world was through glass that couldn't be opened, looking down on a city that seemed a million miles away. Nicholas Metson had meticulously constructed this isolation, brick by psychological brick, until the vibrant young woman who loved to laugh was effectively erased from the world long before her heart actually stopped beating. The mechanism of his control was terrifyingly simple. He became the gatekeeper of her reality. Her mother, Annette, and her siblings, the people who had known her since the moment she took her first breath, were slowly pushed to the periphery. Messages went unanswered. Calls were diverted or monitored. Metson didn't just want Holly. He wanted to possess her completely, and that meant severing every tether she had to a support system. He created a vacuum where his voice was the only truth, his mood the only weather forecast that mattered. If he was angry, the apartment was a storm. If he was calm, it was the eye of a hurricane waiting to shift. Friends who tried to reach out found a wall of silence or strange, clipped responses that didn't sound like Holly at all. He was ghosting them on her behalf, rewriting her social existence while she sat in the next room, likely too terrified to intervene. But the most harrowing indicators of what was to come were not the missed calls or the canceled plans. They were the screams. Not human screams, not yet. They were the cries of the innocent creatures Holly adored. Metson knew that the quickest way to break a person with a heart as soft as Holly's was to destroy the things she loved. He turned their pets into instruments of torture. The police reports and later court testimonies would reveal a litany of horrors that defy comprehension, acts so depraved they suggest a mind that had long since abandoned humanity. Consider the hamsters. Small, fragile lives that Holly cared for. Metson didn't just kill them, he obliterated them. He put them in a food blender. He put them in a microwave. It is a level of cruelty that makes the stomach turn, a deliberate, mechanical destruction of life designed to inflict maximum psychological pain on his wife. He wanted her to see it. He wanted her to know that if he could do this to a helpless animal, there was no limit to what he could do to her. Then there was the puppy, a young dog, full of trust, wagging its tail, looking for affection. In a fit of rage, or perhaps cold calculation, Metson picked up the animal and shoved it inside the washing machine. He closed the door. He turned it on. The sheer auditory horror of that moment, the thudding, the whining, the mechanical whir of the drums spinning a living creature, is the stuff of nightmares. Holly would have been powerless, paralyzed by the sheer violence of the act. When the machine stopped, the message was clear: you are next. The police were called to the flat during this period of escalation. Neighbors heard things. Reports were made about domestic disturbances. But here lies the tragedy of the silent house. When the authorities knocked, it was Nicholas Metson who answered. He was calm, articulate, the picture of a misunderstood husband dealing with a difficult situation. He wore his mask well. He could explain away the noise, the shouts, the strange thuds. And behind him, or perhaps in the other room, Holly remained silent. Coercive control steals your voice. It convinces you that speaking up will only make the punishment worse. It convinces you that the police will leave, but he will stay. And so, the door would close, the officers would leave, and the lock would click shut, sealing Holly back into the darkness with the monster who had just smiled at the law. As March 2023 approached, the atmosphere in the flat shifted from abusive to lethal. The animals were gone or dead. The family was cut off. There were no more buffers left. It was just the two of them in that concrete box in the sky. Metson's behavior was becoming more erratic, his control slipping as Holly perhaps began to show tiny sparks of resistance, or simply because a predator eventually grows bored of the game and craves the kill. The air in the apartment was charged with static, the kind you feel before a lightning strike. The silent house was holding its breath, waiting for the final, inevitable snap of violence that had been promised by every dead hamster, every bruised arm, every silenced phone call. The stage was set for the night of the 17th. March 17th, 2023. A Friday. In the pubs of Lincoln, glasses were likely clinking, laughter spilling out onto the cool evening streets as people celebrated the end of the work week or perhaps raised a pint for St. Patrick. But high up in Shuttleworth House, there was no celebration. There was only the sharp, jagged edge of a marriage that had finally shattered. The air in the flat was no longer heavy with silence. It was vibrating with the frantic, desperate energy of a cornered animal. For months, Nicholas Metson had been tightening the noose of control, isolating Holly, hurting the things she loved. But on this night, something snapped. Maybe Holly had finally found the voice he had tried so hard to crush. Maybe she had threatened to leave, to walk out that door and never come back, to expose the monster behind the mask. We will never know the exact words that passed between them in those final, heated moments, but we know the geography of the violence. It didn't happen in a dark alley or a distant field. It happened in the bedroom, the space that is supposed to be the sanctuary of a marriage, the place of rest and intimacy. Metson turned it into an abattoir. The argument, whatever it was about, escalated with terrifying speed. Metson, the man who had previously taken his rage out on helpless hamsters and puppies, now turned that full, unbridled malice toward his wife. He didn't just strike her, he sought to dominate her completely. He grabbed her. Imagine the sheer physical terror of that moment. The realization that the person you promised to share your life with is now trying to end it. He locked his arm around her head, a chokehold designed to silence, to subdue, to snuff out the fight. But Holly didn't just submit. In those final, frantic seconds of her life, she fought. She fought with the primal, desperate fury of someone who knows they are staring into the abyss. As his arm tightened around her neck, crushing the breath from her, she did the only thing she could. She bit him. She clamped her teeth down onto his forearm, hard. It wasn't a nip, it was a wound, a mark of resistance left on the skin of her killer. It was a testament that she did not go gently. That bite mark would later become a damning piece of evidence, a silent scream from the grave that said, "I tried to stop him." But in that moment, in the adrenaline-fueled chaos of the bedroom, pain often only fuels a killer's rage. The knife came into play. We don't know if he had it ready, if it was under the pillow, or if he grabbed it in a blind fury. But the blade found its mark. Once. Twice. The physical reality of stabbing is horrific. It is intimate, up close, requiring force and intent. It is not like pulling a trigger from a distance. You have to be right there, feeling the life leave the person. Metson stabbed her 4 times, for separate, distinct motions of the arm, for moments where he could have stopped, could have pulled back, could have realized the horror of what he was doing. But he didn't. He drove the steel home until the struggling stopped, until the biting ceased, until the only sound in the room was his own heavy breathing and the slow, steady drip of consequences he couldn't yet comprehend. The violence of the act was absolute. The bedroom, once a place of shared dreams, was now a crime scene, soaked in the reality of what he had done. Holly Bramley, the triplet, the animal lover, the woman with the bright smile, lay dead on the floor. The transition from wife to body had happened in a matter of seconds. The rage that had propelled the knife slowly began to recede, replaced by a cold, calculating pragmatism that is perhaps even more terrifying than the heat of the murder itself. Standing there in the aftermath, with the metallic scent of blood filling the small room, Metson didn't call for an ambulance. He didn't fall to his knees in remorse. He didn't scream for help. He looked at the woman he had just married less than 2 years ago, and he didn't see a person anymore. He saw a problem that needed to be solved. The bite on his arm was throbbing, a reminder of her final act of defiance. But his mind was already moving away from the bedroom, moving towards the next step, the next room. The bathroom. The silence had returned to Shuttleworth House, but it was a different kind of silence now. It was the silence of the tomb. And in that silence, Nicholas Metson began to plan the unthinkable. The blade had done its work. Now, it was time for the tools. The silence of the bedroom was suffocating, broken only by the ragged breathing of a man standing over what remained of his wife. But the horror was not finished. It was merely changing rooms. Dragging the body across the floor, the heavy thud of dead weight against the laminate, Nicholas Metson moved Holly from the sanctuary of their marriage bed to the cold, sterile environment of the bathroom. The door clicked shut. The lock turned. And inside that small, tiled space, a nightmare began that defies human comprehension. This was not a frantic attempt to hide a mistake. This was a project. Metson didn't just panic, he prepared. He didn't use a single knife, he used an arsenal. Police would later find a saw, heavy-duty pruners, and a claw hammer. Tools you might find in a garden shed or a workshop, now laid out on the bathroom floor like instruments of a dark surgery. The water in the bathtub was likely running, a constant, rushing sound to mask the noise of what was to come. The noise of bone meeting steel, of flesh parting under the teeth of a saw. The human mind struggles to grasp the number 200. We can visualize one cut, maybe two. But 224? That is not just a murder. That is an obliteration. It is a frantic, obsessive attempt to erase a person from existence. To cut a human body into over 200 distinct pieces requires time. It requires effort. It requires a level of detachment so profound that it suggests the man wielding the saw was no longer seeing his wife, the woman he had vowed to cherish, but merely meat. Just matter to be processed. Imagine the sheer physicality of it. The bathroom is a small, echoing chamber. Every sound is amplified. The grating of the saw, the snap of the pruners, the splash of water turning pink, then red, then dark. Metson would have been covered in it, the blood of the woman he married. It would have been on his hands, his clothes, perhaps even his face. Yet, he didn't stop. He kept going, piece by piece, hour by hour. This wasn't a crime of passion anymore. It was a crime of endurance. He was working. He didn't just cut. He deconstructed. He removed the fingertips, the identity. He removed the head. He separated limbs from torso, hands from arms, feet from legs. He was dismantling Holly Bramley as if she were a piece of faulty machinery, reducing a complex, beautiful human life into a series of manageable, hideable objects. The claw hammer lay there, perhaps used to break the tougher bones, the dull thud echoing off the tiled walls, a rhythmic percussion to this symphony of slaughter. What was going through his mind as the pile of remains grew? Did he think of their wedding day? Did he think of the hamsters he had tortured, realizing this was the final escalation of that same dark urge? Or was his mind blank, focused solely on the mechanics of the task, the angle of the saw, the pressure on the handle, the need to fit everything into bags? The sheer banality of the evil is what chills the blood. He wasn't chanting rituals. He was likely just sweating, grunting with effort, perhaps stopping to wipe his brow with a bloody hand, treating the dismemberment of his wife like a difficult DIY job that just had to be finished. By the time the bathroom fell silent again, Holly was gone. In her place were bags. Plastic bags for life, the kind you use for groceries, now filled with the wet, heavy reality of a human body. The bathroom would have been a slaughterhouse, slick with gore, smelling of copper and death. Metson, exhausted, stood amidst the ruin he had created. He had successfully turned a person into a puzzle, a jigsaw of flesh and bone that he believed no one would ever put back together. He washed the tools. He likely showered in the very tub where he had just butchered her, watching the red water swirl down the drain, believing that with it, his guilt was washing away too. But the bags remained, and they couldn't stay in the bathroom forever. For 7 days, the flat on the 14th floor of Shuttleworth House became a sealed vessel of secrets. You might think that after turning his wife into a collection of biological debris, a man would flee. Panic would set in. The horror of what lay in those plastic bags would drive him out into the night. But Nicholas Metson didn't run. He stayed. He lived. For a full week, he shared his living space with the dismembered remains of Holly Bramley. The bathroom was clean, scrubbed raw with chemicals, but the problem of the body remained. He couldn't flush 224 pieces away, so he moved them. He carried the heavy, shifting bags for life, a cruel irony in the branding, out of the bathroom and into the kitchen. The kitchen, usually the heart of a home, the place of warmth and sustenance, became a morgue. He opened the larder door, the small pantry cupboard usually reserved for tins of beans and boxes of cereal, and he stacked the bags inside, one by one, the human Tetris of a murderer. He closed the door, and just like that, Holly was put away. But death is not static. It is an active process. Biology doesn't care about the larder door. Within hours, the chemistry of decay began to fight against the plastic. The smell would have started subtly, a faint, sickly sweet odor that lingers at the back of the throat. Then, it would have become undeniable. The stench of decomposing flesh is primal. It triggers a deep, evolutionary alarm in the human brain that screams wrongness. Metson, living in that sealed high-rise box, couldn't ignore it. So he went shopping, not for food, but for the tools of concealment. He bought bleach, gallons of it. He bought ammonia, a chemical so pungent it burns the lining of the nose and makes the eyes water. He wasn't just cleaning. He was waging a chemical war against the reality of what he had done. He poured the solutions down the drains, scrubbed the surfaces, perhaps even doused the bags themselves. The air in the flat turned thick and toxic, a suffocating cocktail of rotting meat and industrial cleaner. It was the smell of a crime trying to hide itself. Imagine the daily routine of those 7 days. Metson waking up in the bedroom where he had strangled and stabbed her, walking down the hallway, entering the kitchen to make a coffee or a sandwich, standing there, waiting for the kettle to boil, knowing that just an arm's length away, behind a thin piece of wood, lay the severed head of his wife. Did he eat in that kitchen? Did he sit at a table and chew his food while the smell of ammonia stung his eyes? The level of compartmentalization required to function in that environment is psychopathic. He didn't just tolerate the horror, he domesticated it. He maintained the facade of a grieving, confused husband to the outside world, all while living in a fumigated tomb. He likely checked the bags, rearranging them, ensuring nothing was leaking, managing the inventory of his atrocity. The larder was no longer a storage space. It was the center of his universe, the black hole around which his entire week revolved. Neighbors might have smelled something strange, strong cleaning products, a hint of something foul in the ventilation, but in a tower block, smells travel, and people mind their own business. No one knocked. No one asked why the fan was always running or why the windows might have been cracked open despite the chill. The police would later describe the smell in the flat as overpowering, a stench that clung to their uniforms long after they left. But for 7 days, Metson breathed it in. It became his atmosphere. He existed in a suspended animation, a week-long pause where time seemed to stop, trapped between the violence of the murder and the inevitable need to dispose of the evidence. He was the keeper of the larder, the guardian of the bags, waiting for the cover of darkness or the help of a friend to finally empty his kitchen of its gruesome contents. But for now, they were roommates, the killer and the pieces of his victim, existing in a silent, reeking pact of secrecy. While the physical remains of Holly Bramley were decomposing in the larder, wrapped in plastic and doused in ammonia, Nicholas Metson set about the macabre task of keeping her digital ghost alive. In the modern age, a person is not just flesh and blood. They are a collection of data, a social media footprint, a blue bubble on a screen. Metson knew this. He knew that as long as Holly's Facebook account was active, as long as her phone sent messages, the world would assume she was still breathing. And so, he became a puppeteer of her online persona, wearing her digital skin, just as he had worn the mask of a loving husband. He sat there, perhaps in the very room where he had killed her, the blue light of her phone illuminating his face. He unlocked her device, a violation of privacy that seems trivial compared to the murder, yet speaks volumes about his total domination of her existence. He opened her messenger apps. He saw the notifications from friends, the worried texts from family who were sensing the silence. And he began to type, but he was not a good mimic. The messages he sent were brief, clipped, devoid of the warmth and specific syntax that made Holly Holly. To a friend asking where she was, he might reply with a vague excuse about being busy or needing space. To her mother, perhaps a short, dismissive text designed to shut down the conversation before it could begin. He was buying time, spending her digital credibility to purchase himself a few more days of freedom. He was ghosting them in the most literal, horrific sense of the word, a ghost operating the machine. But the deception wasn't just about cover. It was about greed. The banality of evil often reveals itself in the smallest, most pathetic details. Metson logged into Holly's bank account. He didn't see the savings of a woman whose life he had stolen. He saw a resource. He transferred money. Not a fortune, just 50 pounds. He stole less than the price of a tank of gas from the wife he had just dismembered. It was a transaction that reduced her life to a petty cash withdrawal, a final insult to the injury of her death. He was funding his survival on the remnants of hers. However, The most chilling window into Nicholas Metson's mind during that week was not what he broadcast to the world, but what he whispered to the search engine. The browser history of a killer is often the truest confession they ever make. While Holly lay in the larder, Metson turned to Google for answers, and his queries paint a portrait of a mind oscillating between cold calculation and existential dread. What benefits do I get if my wife dies? There it was, the mercenary instinct. Before the body was even cold, he was calculating the payout. He was wondering if her death could be profitable, if the state would reward him for being a widower. It is a question that strips away any pretense of accidental rage and reveals a core of absolute selfishness. Can someone haunt me after they die? And here, the cracks. The fear. Living in a flat with the dismembered body of your victim does things to the mind. Did he hear creaks in the floorboards? Did the smell of ammonia trigger hallucinations? He was terrified of her spirit seeking vengeance, even as he physically dismantled her body to prevent it from ever being found. Does God forgive murder? The ultimate question. A search for absolution from an algorithm. He wasn't asking a priest. He was asking the internet. He wanted to know if there was a loophole in the cosmic laws, a way to wash his soul as clean as he was trying to wash the bathroom tiles. He wanted permission to feel okay. He wanted to know if he could get away with it, not just in this life, but in the next. These searches were the frantic scribblings of a man who knew the walls were closing in. He was trying to manage the practicalities of disposal while wrestling with the metaphysical weight of his sin. He was looking for a guide on how to dispose of a dead body 1 minute and asking about salvation the next. It was a chaotic, desperate scramble for control in a situation that had spiraled into madness. But the digital ghost could only haunt the web for so long. People were getting suspicious. The text didn't sound right. The silence was too loud. And the £50 he had stolen? That would soon be used to pay for the final stage of the nightmare. By the evening of March 24th, the air in the flat was no longer just heavy, it was toxic. The ammonia fumes had done their best to mask the scent of death, but biology is persistent. Nicholas Metson knew his time was running out. The digital ghost of Holly Bramley could only fool the world for so long before someone knocked on the door and refused to leave. He needed help. But who do you call when your kitchen larder is stacked with the dismembered remains of your wife? You don't call a professional. You call a friend who needs money. Enter Joshua Hancock, a school friend, a man who perhaps knew the darker side of Metson, or perhaps just a man who didn't ask too many questions. The text message Metson sent was chilling in its banality. It didn't say, "I've killed my wife." It didn't scream for help. It simply offered a transaction. "I'll pay you £50 to help me with a job." £50. That was the price tag. In the economy of this murder, the disposal of a human being was worth less than a night out. It was a job, like moving a sofa or clearing out a garage. Hancock accepted. He arrived at Shuttleworth House under the cover of darkness, stepping into the surveillance state of the high-rise lobby, unknowingly walking into a nightmare that would stain his life forever. When Hancock entered the flat on the 14th floor, the smell must have hit him like a physical blow. The mix of bleach, ammonia, and the underlying, sickly sweetness of decay is not something you can ignore. Did he ask? Did Metson lie and say it was rotten meat, a broken freezer? Or did the two men simply share a look, a silent acknowledgement of the horror that sat behind the larder door? We may never know the exact words spoken, but we know the actions that followed. They needed a vessel. Carrying armfuls of bags for life, through a residential tower block was too risky. They needed something ordinary, something that screamed domesticity to hide the atrocity. They found it in the form of a shopping trolley, a standard metal wire cart from Morrison's, likely stolen or borrowed from the ground floor. It was the ultimate urban camouflage. The process of loading the trolley was a grim exercise in physics. The bags were heavy. Human remains are dense, dead weight. Metson and Hancock had to lift them from the larder, the plastic straining against the contents, and pile them into the cart. One by one, Holly's body parts were transferred from their hiding place to their transport. The sheer indignity of it. A woman who loved animals, who had a family, now reduced to baggage in a stolen grocery cart, is a horror that lingers. Then came the journey down. The elevator ride. In every crime story, there is a moment of high tension where the perpetrators are exposed, vulnerable to discovery. This was it. The elevator doors slid open. They pushed the trolley in. The doors closed. For those few seconds, or minutes, as the lift descended 14 floors, they were trapped in a metal box with the evidence of a murder. The CCTV camera in the corner of the elevator captured them. It recorded the mundane, grainy footage of two men standing next to a shopping trolley filled with bags. To a security guard glancing at a monitor, it looked like two guys taking out the trash or moving house. But the timestamp on that video would later become a critical piece of the timeline, a digital witness to the 50-pound job. Imagine the silence in that elevator, the hum of the machinery, the creak of the cables. Did they speak? Did Hancock nervously tap his foot? Did Metson stare straight ahead, his eyes dead and cold, focusing only on the task? If the lift had stopped, if a neighbor had gotten in with their dog or a child, the smell alone might have given them away. The bags for life were not airtight. The truth was leaking out into the confined space. But the lift didn't stop. It descended smoothly, carrying its cargo of death down to the ground floor, delivering them to the exit where the cool night air of Lincoln waited to receive them. The hard part was done. Now, they just had to find the water. The wheels of the Morrisons' trolley rattled over the paved walkway outside. Shuttleworth House, a jarring, mechanical sound in the quiet of the night. To anyone watching from a window above, it was just two men moving some bags. But inside those bags for life, the reality of Holly Bramley was being carted away. They reached the vehicle, a car, likely not designed for this kind of haulage, and began the heavy, frantic work of loading the boot. The suspension dipped under the weight. 224 pieces of human remains are not light. They are the dense, unyielding burden of a crime that refuses to disappear. Metson got behind the wheel. Hancock, the 50-pound accomplice, sat in the passenger seat. The engine started, and they pulled away from the high-rise, leaving the city of Lincoln behind. They weren't heading for a landfill or a remote forest. They were heading for water. The destination was Basingham, a quiet village about 10 miles southwest of the city. It's a place of scenic walks and riverside paths, a picturesque slice of the English countryside. But tonight, it was a disposal site. The drive would have been a surreal experience. 10 miles of darkness. 10 miles of street lights flashing by, illuminating the faces of two men who had just moved a dismembered body through a lobby. Did they talk? Did Metson explain why? Or was the silence in the car as thick as the smell that must have been seeping from the trunk? The heater might have been running to ward off the March chill, circulating the air, mixing the mundane scent of a car interior with the faint, metallic tang of the cargo in the back. Every police car they passed, Every set of headlights in the rearview mirror would have sent a spike of adrenaline through Metson's veins. He was driving a hearse of his own making. They arrived at the river with him. It's a slow-moving river, dark and opaque at night. They pulled up near the bank, killing the headlights to avoid attention. The darkness of the countryside is different from the city. It is absolute. There were no street lamps here, only the moon and the shadows of the trees stretching over the water like skeletal fingers. They opened the boot. The cold air rushed in, meeting the warm, foul air of the car's interior. They began to unload. One by one, the bags for life were lifted out. They didn't say a prayer. They didn't pause for a moment of respect. They simply swung the bags and let go. Splash. The sound of a heavy object hitting water is distinct. Splash. Another one. Splash. The river accepted them. The current of the rhythm took the bags, some sinking into the silt, others perhaps bobbing just below the surface, buoyed by the air trapped inside the plastic. Holly Bramley, the woman who had once walked down an aisle in a white dress, was now drifting in the cold, murky water of a river 10 miles from home, reduced to parcels of waste. The sheer irreverence of it is what stings, the transformation of a beloved daughter and sister into flotsam. When the boot was empty, the transaction was complete. The job was done. Metson turned to Hancock. The money changed hands. 50 pounds, 2 pink notes, or perhaps a digital transfer for the soul of a woman. It was the cheapest contract killing in history. Only the killing had already been done. This was just the cleanup. Hancock took his fee. He had helped erase a human being for the price of a few rounds of drinks or a tank of petrol. The moral vacuum in that moment, standing by the riverbank with the smell of damp earth and the receding ripples of the bags, is profound. They got back in the car. The drive back to Lincoln was lighter, faster. The weight was gone. Metson returned to Shuttleworth House, to the flat on the 14th floor. The larder was empty now. The bags were gone. The smell of ammonia still lingered, seeping into the carpets and the curtains, a chemical ghost of the week that had passed. But he was alone. He had done it. He had killed her, cut her up, stored her, and now dumped her. He sat in the quiet of the apartment, perhaps believing that the river would keep his secret forever. He thought the water would wash it all away. But rivers have a way of giving things back, and the bags for life were not designed to stay submerged. The morning of March 25th broke over Basingham with the deceptive tranquility of a typical English spring. The river mist clung to the water of the Witham, softening the edges of the reeds and the trees. It was a Saturday. People were out walking their dogs, jogging, escaping the city for a breath of fresh air. The horror of the previous night, the splash of bags in the dark, felt like a bad dream that had dissolved with the sunrise. But the river had not washed the nightmare away. It had merely held it in suspension, waiting for the light. A walker, enjoying the morning peace, spotted something in the water. It wasn't uncommon to see trash in the river, bottles, crisp packets, the detritus of modern life. But this was different. It was a bag, a plastic bag for life, bloated and snagged against the bank or perhaps floating in the reeds. Curiosity, that fatal human instinct, drew the walker closer. Maybe they thought it was someone's lost shopping, or perhaps a legal dumping of household waste. They reached out, maybe with a stick or a hand, to pull it closer, to see what it was. The realization didn't come all at once. It came in a shattering, visceral moment of clarity. Through a tear in the plastic, or perhaps as the bag shifted in the water, a hand appeared. Not a mannequin's hand. Not a doll's hand. A human hand. Pale, waterlogged, the skin cold and dead. The shock of that moment is something the human mind isn't built to process. The peaceful riverbank instantly transformed into a crime scene. The birdsong was replaced by the frantic pounding of a heart. The walkers stumbled back, the bile rising in their throat, and fumbled for a phone to dial 999. The police arrived in force. The serene riverbank became a flurry of blue tape, grim-faced officers and divers slipping into the murky water. They weren't just retrieving one bag, they were retrieving a person. Bag after bag was pulled from the silt and the reeds. The divers, men and women trained for grim tasks, brought up the harvest of Nicholas Metson's 50-pound job. In total, they recovered 224 distinct parts of Holly Bramley. Some were never found. Her heart, the very center of her being, remained lost to the river, a final, tragic mystery. While the divers worked in the cold water of Basingham, another team of officers was speeding towards Lincoln, towards the brutalist silhouette of Shuttleworth House. They knew who lived there. They knew who the bags belonged to. The investigation had moved at lightning speed, tracing the evidence back to the 14th floor. When they arrived at the flat, the smell of ammonia and bleach still hung in the air, a chemical confession that hit them the moment the door opened. Nicholas Metson was there. He didn't run. He didn't fight. He stood in the wreckage of his marriage, surrounded by the invisible ghosts of the last week. The officers began their search, moving through the rooms where he had killed, dismembered, and stored his wife. They found the saw. They found the pruners. They found the bloodstains that no amount of bleach could fully erase. The flat was a map of violence, every surface whispering the story of what had happened. But it was Metson's reaction that truly chilled the officers. In the face of undeniable evidence, surrounded by the police who were dismantling his life, just as he had dismantled Holly's, he didn't break down. He didn't cry. He made a joke. "She might be hiding under the bed," he said. The words hung in the air, a poison. She might be hiding under the bed. It was a comment so callous, so deeply devoid of humanity, that it stunned the room. He was mocking them. He was mocking her. He was standing in the very place where he had butchered her, knowing her. Body parts were currently being fished out of a river 10 miles away, and he thought it was funny to suggest she was playing hide-and-seek. It was the final mask slipping. The paper mask was gone, and beneath it was a void. He was arrested on the spot. The handcuffs clicked shut, ending his week of freedom, his 7 days of living with the dead. He was let out of Shuttleworth House, past the neighbors who had heard nothing, past the lift where he had wheeled the trolley, and into the back of a police van. The silent house was silent no more. It was now the center of a murder investigation that would shock the nation. The river had given up its secret. The hand in the water had pointed directly back to him. And now, Nicholas Metson would have to answer for every cut, every bag, and every moment of terror he had inflicted on the woman he promised to love. The courtroom was silent, a sterile chamber of justice where the air felt thin and cold. It was April 5th, 2024. Nicholas Metson stood in the dock, the paper mask of the charming husband now completely stripped away, revealing the void beneath. He wasn't the man who had walked down the aisle in a crisp suit. He was a murderer facing the weight of his own atrocity. But even here, in the final act of this tragedy, the horror was in the details. The prosecutor didn't just speak of death, they spoke of obliteration. The forensic team had done their work. They had retrieved 224 distinct parts of Holly Bramley from the River Witham. It was a number that echoed off the courtroom walls, a statistic that turned stomachs and brought tears to the eyes of seasoned officers. But the most haunting fact wasn't what they found, it was what they didn't. Despite the divers, despite the searches, despite the technology, some parts of Holly were never recovered. Her heart, the physical engine of her love, her kindness, her life, remained lost to the river. It was a final, cruel theft. Metson had not only taken her life, he had denied her family the dignity of a complete burial. He had scattered her. When the charges were read, the tension in the room was palpable. For months, he had denied it. He had spun lies, created stories, played the confused victim. But the evidence was a tidal wave. The searches for God's forgiveness, the purchase of ammonia, the CCTV of the 50-pound job, the hand in the water, it was insurmountable. Metson looked at the judge and, perhaps for the first time, realized the game was over. He pleaded guilty. Guilty. One word. 2 syllables. A confession that confirmed what everyone already knew. The man who had promised to protect Holly was the one who had destroyed her. But the voice that truly mattered in that courtroom wasn't Metson's. It was Annette's, Holly's mother. She stood, trembling with a grief that is beyond language, and delivered a victim impact statement that cut through the legal jargon like a knife. She spoke of her daughter not as a victim, but as a light, a triplet, a lover of animals, a woman who had been isolated, controlled, and finally butchered by a man she trusted. She looked directly at Metson, the man who had once called her Mom, and delivered the verdict that history will remember. He is an evil monster, she said. He has not just killed my daughter. He has destroyed our family. He has taken a piece of all of us that we will never get back. The judge listened. The sentence was life. A life sentence for a life taken. Metson was led away, back to a cell where the silence would be absolute, where he would have decades to stare at the walls and perhaps, in the deep of the night, see the ghosts of the hamsters, the puppy, and the woman he dismantled. Joshua Hancock, the friend who had sold his soul for 50 pounds, was also sentenced for obstructing a coroner, a grim footnote in the story of a husband's ultimate betrayal. And so, the story of the silent house comes to an end, but the echo remains. Shuttleworth House still stands, a concrete sentinel over the city of Lincoln. The River Witham still flows, its dark waters holding the secrets of that March night. But Holly Bramley is gone. The bright, animal-loving young woman was erased by a darkness that lived in her own bedroom. It is a reminder that sometimes the most terrifying monsters aren't hiding under the bed or in the closet. Sometimes they are lying right next to you, wearing a wedding ring, waiting for the moment the mask slips. The darkness of Nicholas Metson was not a sudden storm. It was a slow, creeping rot. And while the law has closed the case, the question he asked Google remains unanswered in the silence of his cell. Does God forgive murder? Perhaps. But the river, the mother, and the memory of a girl cut into 224 pieces, they never will.